So whatever image you have, you see, will have a particular boundary. And everyone's is likely to be different if they're in mixed different traditions. Sometimes traditionally you can have just one idea but many variations of that one idea. Now if you can do that, then we may know openly what is in fact the unknowable. First time he uses this language. And what will you then discover? That the darkness beyond being conceals the truth. Because that image, that filtering device is nothing other than the screen. And when we think of dropping that screen, we panic. And our panic is nothing other than what we're clinging to, and that's our own darkness. So, this is a particular interesting way of going, and we can talk about it later. This is also the form of a dialectic. Now, then, what may be affirmed? What can be affirmed? Can anything be affirmed of that?
No.
What's interesting, what he does, is he goes through a review of 3 of his works. The Theological Outlines, Divine Names, Symbolic Theology. Why? This is so clever. The guy is so interesting. Because by making you go through this, you'll see then that you may, in fact, recognize there may be some of those images attached to your idea of God. And then what do you have to do? You have to see in what way you can say you can affirm them. So now we have a different shift entirely. You see, there is a way of affirming what may be affirmed of God. Now, if you want to speak and you want to explain the nature of God, then here's your task. Here's your task. And this is the work called Theological Outlines. He said what you should be able to do is learn how to talk about God as one, as 3, as a fatherhood, as sonship, as spirit. That means there is a vocabulary. There is a vocabulary appropriate for each. There's a way of talking about each that's distinctive. There's a way in which this is hierarchically arranged. So therefore, notice the word he now says, which is interesting. You see, you have to see how he is in himself. You want to see how these relate in themselves, by himself, in himself, right? Then you want to see how these are mutual terms. You want to see how there is a co-eternal aspect to each of them. That means co-eternal, that they exist together in various ways, right? And you want to see then that each, most importantly, how there's a propagation from each of these, how from each one of these there's something that follows that is propagated, generated. Right? And then finally you have to see how Jesus is the substance of the human nature, You see, what does that mean? That means we're taking a course in language. We're learning how to make distinctions. When you're talking about how to affirm what kind of affirmations you can make about God, you know what that will do? I will say, okay, if you want to say certain things about God, then this is what you can do. You have to decide whether he's one. You have to know the vocabulary of it. How he's 3 or a trinity. You have to be able to talk about them. You have to know how each of the parts relate, because there's a mutuality between them. You have to talk about each part of the Trinity. You have to know that there's a certain vocabulary in a certain way that's appropriate to each. You're disciplining your mind. You're disciplining your thinking. Right? So therefore, that if you do have an image of God in your mind, now at least it's consistent. You know what you're doing. It's not unconscious. Because this is the God about which you can affirm something. That is, God that is. So you get an education in theology. Okay, now what is the proper way to talk about all of these? You should know what you're talking about in a theology that affirms things about the nature of God and the whole theology. All right, so what else do you need? He's got another work called the Divine Names. Now, notice, same structure, how he may be called good, being, life, wisdom, and power.
Those names that you have up there are different, or those terms you have up there are different than the ones you just had.
Because the other ones are theological terms. These are philosophical.
Okay, and those terms you had are, in my understanding, related to Christianity.
Yes.
So he's focusing within Christianity on terms that they would know.
But he's going to use terms that are philosophical when he defines them theologically. He's going to give you a philosophical vocabulary to talk about each one of those.
Okay, thank you.
That's clever. All right, look. The next work he has, which he's quoting, he's giving a description of this in the work, his symbolic theology. Now, do you know what you have to do? You now have to see, you have to take a course in symbolic theology. You have to know how divine names can be taken from sense experience, how they can be taken from divine forms, from figures, from members of the body, as it were, from places, from certain realms. Because this allows you to talk about God as an image. The proper way to talk about God is an image. Ah, what does that do? That means systematically, any idea you have as you go through this, if he has a whole catalog of ideas that can be called and identified as being images of God, you may discover some of your own. And now you know that they belong in this theology. What is that doing? It's identifying them and positioning them and showing how they should be used. But none of these deal with the mystical theology. Now, if all of these terms, if all of the possible terms in these three categories can then be ordered in such a way that we know their proper use, then you're not going to apply them. That's right, to the highest term. He. That's right, that's where they got it. Yeah. That's where they got it. Bayezid, that's where he got it. Yeah. Right. Now, these, as you know, are the key Platonic terms. The good, being, life, wisdom, power. Right. These are the proper names. These are called the divine names. And by the way, the last set of names he uses in this work come right out of Plato's Parmenides. So, now, with all of this, what can you say about the Maker? Now, this is real curious writing. And I'd like to have a little fun with you, and we can read it together, because it's so clever the way he is writing this. Of course, everything I'm saying comes out of the text. All right. Let me first ask you a question that's important to me. If you neither lack money nor a car nor humor, what have you? Thank you. Say it louder. Very good. What a good class. Now watch the language. Now he's going to talk about God the Maker. And notice the language. I'm on page 31, section 4. We say, therefore, that the transcendent Maker of all things lacks neither being, nor life, nor reason,